and then we'll let people in, Emma.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this talk. So this is a first talk that we're doing as part of Cultures of Film with the lovely Emma. Just let this person in. Perfect. So how this will run is Emma will do her talk and we've got time at the end for questions and answers. So if you've got any questions at any point during the period of Emma's presentation, if you just pop them in the chat and then we can come to them at the end and Emma will answer as many questions as possible within the time. So Emma, I will hand over to you. I'll let you get started. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. So we've had a bit of like technical issues, so I can't actually see any of my notes. So I apologize. I'm going to have to sort of try and remember what I'm saying. So yeah, I apologize for any kind of stumbling or accidentally remembering things last minute. But hi, yeah. So my name's Emma Andrews. I'm a research fellow in the National Centre for Great Health here at the School of Arts and Humanities. But my background is originally in linguistics. So I did my PhD here and my master's, which was around media accessibility for both deaf and hard of hearing people and blind and partially sighted people. So I am also a deaf person, full disclosure. I use subtitles a lot. I have produced subtitles as a freelance subtitler, and my master's was about characterization and how that could be affected by kind of different choices that are being made when it comes to subtitling. So for this talk, I'm going to be talking about the kind of the increase since I started working in this area of like auto-generated subtitles and sort of the use of AI and machine-generated subtitling. Sorry, the little pink things are distracting me. So yeah, so we're going to look essentially at the role that humans still have in subtitling and also actually some of the positives of where auto subtitling comes into. So first off, I think it's important to say that I'm talking about intralingual subtitling. So you get interlingual, which is translating from one language to a different language, so a foreign language to English, say, or vice versa. Whereas intra is same language subtitling. So quite often it's associated with deaf and hard of hearing audiences, but there's a lot more people that use it than just that. So this is a definition that comes from two authors who have written a lot of work in the space in both inter and intralingual subtitling, and they talk about the way that it's a substitution for the spoken dialogue that needs to be then represented in a written sort of fashion. So what that kind of translatory aspect is. So who uses same language subtitles? I mean, at a baseline level, it's probably all of you to some extent, especially in recent years. Again, a lot of my research took place before a lot of things like reels and short video components, which are now much more prolific. So you see a lot of subtitles day to day. Often it's through technical kind of aspects where it's just that people often have the sound off on things like phones. People are in busy places watching videos. So subtitles offer quite a mercantile way to keep people's attention or kind of get people to actually want to turn the sound on potentially in those cases. But this isn't new. So even in the early 2000s, when they were doing surveying of who uses intralingual subtitling, they found predominantly that it was about 80% people with no hearing impairment whatsoever. So they were quite, they didn't need them to understand what was going on. And that hasn't changed. There was a more recent study that came out a few years ago by Verizon, I think, in the US, that came up with similar numbers, which was again about 80% of people that use them don't actually require them in a sort of accessibility way. So we also have second language speakers, so quite often learners. It's useful for them as a point of reference to be able to kind of pick up on spelling conventions, things like that. Just recognition of language. It's an extra visual cue for people to associate with the sound. Certain neurodivergent people will use intralingual subtitling either because of things like auditory processing disorders, where it's harder to actually figure out, what is being said in real time, or where you may have trouble figuring out intent or tone of voice. They're often marked in subtitles, so they can be useful for that kind of contextual knowledge for people. So as I mentioned before, we've got kind of short form social media consumers, which is, a lot of people, and there's an overlap between actually young people are way more likely to use subtitles, even though older people are more likely to be deaf and kind of benefit from actually the accessibility side of them. But young people are much, much more comfortable with subtitles, which I think is part of that wider social media kind of environment. There's also been changes in how films are kind of broadcast and the sound design of films, so you get a lot lower sort of dialogue. It's kind of a lot of the times strive for like realisticness, which kind of often means like mumbling or kind of it's not this enunciated speech that you previously got in films. So that can be quite difficult as well with like home media environments. So people then rewatching a movie at home, the sound levels will be completely different. So people might be way quieter than the rest of the soundtrack. So people sometimes have them on to try and kind of mitigate that. Also things like accent, where we have more access to kind of a wider variety of international media. So even where it is technically, same English, same language, it's like world English, but it may be that there's a specific accent. So one of the examples that's often kind of given is the way that Trainspotting, which is obviously strong sort of Scots, is kind of subtitled in America, because it's very hard for non-speakers to actually follow that in a meaningful way. So there's a lot more people using subtitles for a lot of different kind of things, but there's been a big push in the past 10 years to actually get things subtitled and to actually have that accessibility. Things like streaming have really increased the number of kind of access points you can have. So you can have several kind of tracks, DVDs, increase them again as well. So it just feels like it's become much, much easier to access subtitles. So they have kind of benefited more people. So then when we come down to the kind of auto-generated part of the subtitling, and what actually a machine is good at compared to a human, because I also don't want to be fully like, there's no place for auto subtitling, there's no sort of need for it, because actually it can do a lot of things that are useful. And I say this as somebody who uses subtitles day to day. So they're pretty basic. So speed and scalability are big ones. So a machine can subtitle an hour-long thing way faster than a human being having to listen and transcribe that at the same pace. They can also do it with multiple things. You could have a whole series of videos that just get fed into this, and it gets spat out with an okay-ish, potentially, set of subtitles. So the obvious benefit to a lot of the wider world at the moment is the low cost, because having to pay for several hours of somebody's time versus being able to either do it for free or have a sort of fixed price for this huge bulk of stuff that it can do. It's appealing to people, whether that is on a kind of greed basis from larger corporations, or whether that's small independent creators who don't have the time or the money to be able to kind of pay for this kind of service. So ultimately, it's the idea of it being better than nothing, particularly when it comes to things like YouTube. Like, sometimes it is bad, sometimes it's okay. Like I have used, auto-generated subtitles. I found them useful even when there are mistakes, especially when you know that this video that's 2 hours long would not necessarily have any other subtitles without this. So it's a case of don't let perfect be the enemy of good, I guess, sometimes. But then obviously it has some drawbacks. So I probably should have warned there are some like swears in this. So hopefully people will enjoy that and not take it too personally. But these are some examples of the kinds of accidental transcriptions through auto captioning. So we've got the Mets on their hot streak ovulate, which obviously was of late. We've got fresh gators on the ice down at the bottom, which is skaters, but it's made worse by the Gatorade advert that you can see in the background. It makes it like extra egregious and noticeable. Then we have some taboo stuff here. So we have the iPhone 6. It's got a bigger screen and it's more powerful though. So that's something. And also we have who was Horus, the falcon god of the sun, which I'm not going to repeat this, but you can read it. So at best they can be kind of like funny and sort of like vaguely amusing, but at worst they can probably be kind of offensive, because you can imagine, if this was in like a serious news broadcast or a press conference or something, this could, maybe not be great. Which leads us to one of the areas where, we see this auto subtitling a lot of the time is actually in live streaming of things, because it benefits from that quickness that human beings don't have. So there are ways of humans being able to do live streaming, but it's always going to be at a greater delay than the respective auto-generated live subtitles, because there just is no easy way to kind of predict what people are going to say and be able to do that in advance. So you can rely on this, but it's always worth checking afterwards on either later broadcasts, or in the case of the Falcon God at the bottom, that could have been edited because that was a YouTube video. So, it's this thing about actually having that kind of hand in checking what is put out and not just relying on it instinctively. So also when we talk about auto-generated subtitles, they're thought of a lot of time as kind of just transcription. Whereas we can kind of see that these two pieces of text are exactly the same. They have exactly the same content. They would be transcribed exactly the same by an AI. But if you look at the actual content of how this is said, you can tell that they're different. There's something different about these things. So we were having trouble with this video clip with sound. So, I'm just praying this works. But anyway, let's go. Let's see if this works. So this is actually those two examples in video form.
Oh, shoot. Keegan's been texting me. Sorry, dude. Missed your texts. I assumed we'd meet at the bar. Whatever. I don't care.
Sorry, dude, missed your texts. I assumed we'd meet at the bar. Whatever, I don't care. Whatever, I don't care? The fuck is his problem?
Okay, so I'm really hoping that did work. But even if it didn't, I think you can probably tell something based on the body language of the two characters, the facial expressions, which also brings in a big part of subtitling, is that you're not just always relying on the words, you're relying on many, many other cues, whether they're verbalized or, in audiovisual settings, the actual visual components. So it's not that you always have to be able to one-to-one convey these aspects, because you have to also think about what is being conveyed by the way the characters are moving their bodies, the expressions that they're pulling whilst they say stuff. But then there's so much in the delivery of the different kind of words, even though they are the same words, and that's the joke of this bit. So so that leads us into the kinds of things that humans do well, is thinking about stuff like that a lot of the time. So we have things like emphasis and phrasing. So we saw that in that previous clip, where it's about like volume changes, it's emphasis on certain words where people view them as the important salient words, which it can be hard actually to identify those particular words without use of things like italics and bold. But also we have kind of these points of reference in brackets that are used to kind of convey paralinguistic elements, so aspects that are useful to interpreting wider linguistic content, but are not actually word-based linguistic content in themselves. So, we have things like where characters will talk over one another. We'll have things like where they have a particular sort of, someone is about to cry in this one, where she found the remains of her ostrich, whereas this guy is upset. And you see this also delivered in things like the use of ellipsis. So you can see him hesitating and sort of stammering, like he's unsure on this phone call. So not only is it done through that kind of actual signpost of the stammering, but we see it then again in the ellipsis that's used. So we see that again in the one on the left-hand side as well, where she's using it to kind of trail off instead of it being a kind of more abrupt kind of staccato stammering. So we also have things like tone of voice, which might be very direct in terms of, and it doesn't have to be human. So in this case, it's R2-D2, the robot from Star Wars, and his beeps and how they are they're directly referenced as being confident by the other character as well. So the subtitler can kind of relatively confidently know that, you know, these are happy kind of sounds, these are confident sounds. We also have a convention that exists quite often that involves putting exclamation marks or question marks in brackets to display things like irony or sarcasm. So in this case, the question, the statement like that would explain everything is a sarcastic one. It's like her being like, oh yeah, that would explain everything, which it wouldn't. So hence this is almost like a visual reference for like, this is not a genuine comment, this is not a genuine question, which you see happen quite a lot in terms of tone and voice. So it is also important, and I will reference this at the end, a lot of these aspects overlap with one another because they are all kind of modulating this wider meaning within this kind of cinematic dialogue and the wider kind of context that it sits in. So as mentioned before, you know, tone of voice is difficult without the facial expressions that go with it as well. So that's especially useful in things like animated TV shows where it's harder to actually pin down a real facial expression on somebody unless it's been kind of very clearly drawn in that way. So then we also have sound effects, just general sound effects that are not made by a human. So it's thought about what that actually means. So we have at the bottom, we have Airbud, who is a famous dog, commenting on the basketball. I think he's a basketball playing dog, in fact, but I don't know that much about sports. But he is subtitled as just continuing to bark when his other commentator is trying to talk. We also have things like silence being noted. So where a automated, you know, process would recognize silence as silence, it's about recognizing when silence is meaningful in some way in a narrative. So, you know, in this case, people are waiting for a phone to ring, expecting a phone to ring, and the point is that this phone is not ringing. So it's ensuring that the deaf audience isn't, you know, out of that kind of feeling of anticipation or, you know, that same kind of moment of realization that the characters are having, that the hearing audience is having of this kind of phone not ringing. We also have, as we talked about briefly before, things like accent and dialect, as well as other languages that kind of exist within a wider piece. So quite often you get the joke about, you know, where it'll be like speaking Korean or whatever, and that'll be the only subtitle you get for somebody speaking a different language. Where actually, I mean, I could talk about that a lot more because there's a lot of nuance that goes into when things are translated, who is aware of what is being said. But for a lot of things, we have, you know, words that are ostensibly quote unquote foreign words, but they exist in, you know, English speech. So we have chérie at the bottom there, and you can see that it's been sort of highlighted as being kind of a French word with its kind of, well, with the French spelling and the italics that are used to kind of identify that as part of a kind of a separate piece, so it's not a mistake, it's a deliberate kind of inclusion. And on the left, we have the deliberate sort of showing of it being a Manchester accent, which is notable in that it's from the BBC soap opera EastEnders, which is set down south, so not in Manchester. So a lot of the characters have London accents, have Southern England accents, whereas this character clearly is, you know, like a novelty, a new thing that you wouldn't necessarily see. And equally, you have kind of aspects of that northernness in the sort of A being used twice, the mad for it, like, I don't know, it feels very stereotypically northern, which is kind of one of those aspects where I don't know how well that cultural sensitivity has been done, because it feels a bit sort of slapsticky, kind of jokey. But that's kind of one of the things where you need to kind of figure out that nuance of like, why is this important? Like, it's clearly significantly different to be flagged up to an audience as being salient for some reason, but then you have to think about actually the responsibility of how you're going to represent that. So, for example, you get it quite often where people will spell things phonetically, and it will seem really awkward and uncomfortable to people who speak in that accent, or have that dialect, because it comes across very clumsily kind of done. So you've got to really modulate between actually recognizing points that need to be made, but also not overdoing it or misrepresenting people in some way. So then we also have paralinguistic features, which I talked about briefly earlier, with things like the kind of tone of voice and the emphasis. But we also have kind of more direct ones. So we have the reference to the I don't know sound, so the sort of noise that I guess you would make, which goes with his face as well. So you've got that combination of the kind of sound effect and the associated facial expression. In the other one, we have two characters who are singing the theme song to Jaws and getting faster as they're being more enthusiastic about it. So we have them referred to as bums, which I guess is the but. So a lot of these are kind of these weird things that you would never ever really have to think about how to represent in a sort of textual way, because it doesn't exist in text a lot of the time. Whereas subtitlers often have to kind of make it exist in some way and keep it thematically interesting and obvious to audiences that are using them. So, we've seen this in a lot of examples in general, like humor and sort of more nuanced and subtle kind of aspects of communication are much harder to kind of convey. So you've got obvious stuff like jokes. So homophones, where two words will sound the same but be different words. So we have a joke from Pulp Fiction where they're telling a joke about a tomato being told to catch up and getting squashed and it being ketchup. So one of the techniques that's often used is that you will take the less obvious referent and use that to convey the pun. So hence ketchup being in the sort of quotation marks. So you realise that is the punchline. And if it's less obvious, you've got at least somewhat of a chance of tying it then back to the previous the pun that it is based on. We also have kind of contextual knowledge that can be based on stuff that's happened previously in a scene. So in the example on the left, we have there's a running reference to a Fabergé egg in the background that someone's getting told off that they're gonna break if they keep messing about. And then there's this person's trying to be interviewed, and then this is the subtitle when we hear like a smash in the background. So it basically harkens back to that reference point of the Fabergé egg, so we know exactly what has been broken in the background of this kind of scene. It ties in with that wider joke, and that a Fabergé egg is kind of just like a somewhat bizarre kind of phrase to see in a subtitle. So that kind of salience of it being there is just adds to the kind of humor aspect of it. Obviously humor is always going to be subjective. I'm not saying everything in this presentation is hilarious, but we're just trying to do a broad cover. So often a lot of these things are being kind of modulated at once as well. So we have different modes of these happening at once. So for example, in the penguins, we have to not only know that whatever this foreign language that these penguins speak is called Penguinese, but also this particular penguin is speaking it with a French accent, which is incredibly specific. But when you think about it, it's like, oh, this probably is actually relevant to the plot in some way. This visitor is a foreign penguin who has come and has a foreign accent, so it needs to be represented. But and then we have somebody talking about how great they were at doing an accent, and then they continue to do the accent to prove how good they are at it, but it's terrible, so it needs to be referenced in the subtitles that their Australian accent is really bad, which obviously ties in with the humor of him claiming that he's nailed it. Okay, so I'm going to do like a very quick kind of example here of one particular, because obviously I did do linguistic analysis, so I'm going to do a little bit of that, but it's nothing super exciting because I did not time this all very well. But so hopefully this is another clip. Hopefully the sound will work on this one. I still have no idea whether the sound worked on the last one, so we'll see.
Sound is working, Emma. Just a
amazing. I'm so relieved. Okay, cool. So here's another
So
really
if
short.
you want paper towels in there, you'll just have to supply your own.
Are you kidding? Where do you get paper towels?
And last item, on a related note, I have no choice but to cut salaries.
Okay, so that's from Archer, which is a cartoon that is very good. Has a lot of quickfire references, has a lot of funny subtitles. It was very hard not to actually just theme the whole presentation around this, but I tried to do some variety. So essentially what we're interested in here is these two subtitles. So they are conveying the complaints of these people, both about having no more paper towels in the break room and also about all their salaries being cut. So when we think about that, we have to think about what actually is happening in that scene. Like, what is the scene attempting to kind of achieve? So we have things like the humor of it. So we have the fact that they're all complaining about these very minor things, and then also this very large thing. We have the actual noise that they're making, the kind of sound of the complaining. We have the fact that there are 6 of them all doing it, so there are multiple speakers at once, even though they're not actually kind of necessarily talking at once in a way that's understandable to a hearing audience. The attitude and position of the speakers, so how they feel about this information and how that changes their reaction, and yeah, so the change of position in their kind of attitudes. So we have this in a sort of parallel sentence structure, which is almost this kind of like chiral kind of way of thinking about it. So if you think about like your hands, they're kind of almost identical, but they don't actually map onto each other. You know, if you try to put a right glove on a left hand, it won't fit because that's not, like, they have the same bones, they're in a different order basically. So this kind of works similar to that, but almost in the reverse, where it's they're in the same order, but they've got different bones. So they start with this adjective, they have an adverb that follows it, and then they have the verb of bitching. So already the two things are very clearly tied together. They kind of reflect one another. Just sort of visually, you can see that. So then when we take the kind of initial, the initial adjective, wait, sorry. Yeah, adverb. It's alliterative, so you've got the 2 L's that kind of pair them together, but the use of low as an opposite to loud rather than something like quiet still kind of conveys that overlapping speech, that there's multiple people, that they're still talking, they've not stopped talking, they've not kind of simmered down, they're still complaining about things. And then loud obviously just brings it up to become this sort of bigger, noisier kind of engagement. So then we have half-hearted and full-hearted, and this is sort of a rhetorical question, but like, when was the last time you heard anybody use the adjective like full-hearted? Because I've never really heard anybody thinking about it. So if we look at the engrams, so engrams basically reveal kind of statistical significance of how frequently words occur. This is just taken from Google Books. So they basically will utilize all these books from 1800 to 2020 with all their nice data they have, and you can see the occurrence of terminology. So we can see how much more common half-hearted is. Like, full-hearted is barely used. We have like a bit of a dip. There was some brief sort of overlap here, but that was a long time ago, so probably not as pertinent now. So from that, we can kind of make this assumption that the use of full-hearted in this is a direct response to half-hearted, which would be the more common phrase that we would hear. So it's still keeping that kind of parallelness, even at the expense of potentially using more sort of well understood or more common words. And then finally we have bitching, which stays the same in both of them. So it keeps their consistent complaining. It keeps the fact that they are all of them a group that likes to complain. It's kind of slightly taboo in that it's, you know, the word bitch as a sort of verb is, I mean, I wouldn't say it's like massively so, but it kind of keeps that kind of playful, frivolous, sort of adult humor vibe as well. Like it also is kind of frivolous in the sense that it, bitching is relatively like low level. It's not particularly sort of like powerful. It's not particularly sort of, which pairs well with kind of loud and full-hearted bitching, because it makes them seem kind of powerless in a way. So basically, okay, we're on 30 minutes. Cool. So summarizing back to kind of what any of this actually means for the wider piece of sort of robot human interaction in terms of creating subtitles. So they're not going to disappear. Like, this technology is already out. It is easy to use. It is cheap. To be like, oh yeah, we should just stop it. We should always employ human subtitlers. It'd be great, but it's not going to happen. So, it's then thinking about how the use of auto-generated subtitles are already benefiting kind of human subtitlers. And a lot of it is in taking away a lot of the kind of very boring administrative side of it, which is actually just the transcription and the kind of writing out all of the, I have physically done this myself for my master's. I had to transcribe a lot of text to compare it to subtitles in a corpus linguistics setting. But actually, nowadays, I could have done that in an afternoon, like so easy. And then I could have gone back through what I was doing and spent that more time on the nuance and actually on thinking about how I could convey certain aspects of it, rather than the bulk of the time being spent just transcribing, just listening to things, because it takes time. It takes real weeks and months of work for something that could be mostly done in a sort of technical sense in a day. So actually it saves time if it's being used correctly in a way that benefits human subtitlers as well. So, oh, this is me. I just realized, I don't know if you know, this is me, and this is my favorite robot from Robot Wars, Matilda. She's great. She's who I would most like to collaborate with. So I would like to create subtitles with her. But yeah, basically the point I'm making is that the advocacy should shift to actually the role that human subtitlers have that is valuable in this space, and the things that they can do that robots and auto-generated subtitling can't, and the way in which, their time can be valued to be put towards the actual thought behind their choice of words, particularly when it comes to the aspect of language that is completely incomprehensible to auto-generated kind of subtitles, either from a very base level of they don't know what a rumbling sound is, they don't know what it's being made by, they don't know what that means, whereas a human being could think about that and be like, what animal is making a rumbling sound? Where is, what is a truck idling somewhere that's going to be? So basically it's just trying to advocate for that kind of human intervention in that wider piece of subtitle development, and utilizing the robot aspect for the things that it's good at, the things that we find boring and time consuming and difficult, and then actually following that up with real human thought about things, which offers a nice middle ground, particularly for instances like smaller channels like YouTube channels and things like that, where they couldn't necessarily afford to employ somebody entirely based around accessibility. But what they could do is firstly have their auto-generated subtitles and then choose to go back and maybe pay somebody to edit them, or edit them themselves, and not have to put in the same amount of work that they would have to kind of without that. So I think I rattled through this really fast because I don't have my notes. So I think that is the last slide. I have finished slightly early, but then there's like 10 minutes, I guess, for questions, if anybody has any questions or anything they want to share. Yeah, thank you all for coming. I hope this is interesting, at least to some degree. Yeah, so thank you.
Oh, I don't know. I think Claire Ben put a hand up then, but I don't know whether she'll be able to actually speak because I think the camera and the microphone turn off. Yeah, so any questions, if you pop them in the chat, and then we can ask Emma to answer them. I think there
I'm
has
also
been some
just
comments,
finally
Emma.
looking at, yeah, I'm just finally looking
Yeah.
at them. They're all great. Everybody always has a story about some hilarious auto subtitle they've seen somewhere that's been like the worst thing ever, and it's just like, oh my god. So
I really
yeah,
enjoyed the
RP
Irish
art,
accent one.
amazing.
Oh, Claire said she was trying to clap rather
Oh,
than put her hand up.
thanks, Claire. That's
Fair
you
enough,
can put your
Claire.
hand up. You can clap. I love you regardless. Thank you. Yeah. I can see people are typing, so I'm happy to just sort of chill and let people do that.
It was interesting actually because I've had the live captions on as well, just to see what the AI would come up with, and it was interesting because when there was an AI word or a word that was deemed maybe by the AI as swearing, it just started out.
Yeah, it does that on Teams, I think.
Yeah.
Also, I see that Steve's mentioned the character might have been putting on an accent. Yeah, he definitely could have been, actually. I didn't even consider that because I'm not a big EastEnders fan. So it's just kind of I was looking for accent representation. But yeah, and equally that would still be significant because it would be the point is that this dude is doing an accent or doing a voice similar to the kind of bad Australian accent before. But then, interestingly, the bad Australian accent was noted as being bad or not being, whereas the Manchester one wasn't. Which again, it's dependent on what individual subtitlers notice as well. So it's not, there's not a prescriptive way to be like you always have to do it like this. A lot of it, you see people's sort of personal feelings or personal kind of stuff coming out in certain ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Cool. So you've got a couple of questions now, Emma. So
Okay,
Joe has asked, how rapidly does the tech seem to be improving? Does it seem feasible that AI will soon be able to capture more emotions and elements of speech?
The tech has improved quite quickly in terms of the transcription stuff in recent years. Like I remember, a point where it would be kind of borderline incomprehensible, and now, unless it's a very different accent than it's used to, and even then sometimes I've been surprised by how well it's done with a lot of things. I remember watching something that was a BBC Scots thing, and it was doing okay, and I was pretty impressed with that as a automated YouTube caption. I'm not sure that it will be able to capture kind of emotions, honestly, because I think that would be it's that kind of nuanced aspect of actually having to be able to think about meaning and why something is the way it is. I mean, there might be certain vocal aspects. I'm not sure. This would probably be a question for somebody that's more actually on that kind of vocal side of things as well, because it could be that there are kind of markers of things like that. But whether an AI would then be able to ascribe that to a particular kind of emotion per se, like it could be like, oh, this is higher, or this is lower, or this is more sort of broken up, or so yeah. So I think whilst the tech has improved, I think there's always going to be like an ultimate kind of limit in terms of that nuanced side of things. So yeah.
Cool. So, and the next question, Emma, from Steve, is there a further angle that a human subtitler can apply more nuance around, whether a reference might land with somebody who has been deaf from birth, for example, might not understand what a rumbling sound might be?
Yeah, totally. So this is a big thing actually, because it is the idea of actually, if you're profoundly deaf, even if you could envision what a rumbling, because you could imagine the kind of physical properties of it, it's whether that has the same kind of contextual meaning for you, I suppose. It's a bit like the whole describing color to blind people, but at the same time, as a parallel for that, it doesn't mean that people can't necessarily understand the use of it in a kind of cinematic or narrative way. So you may have encountered things like pathetic fallacy, where you've got like thunder or rain or whatever that are used to kind of mimic a particular atmosphere. And whilst you might not be able to hear aspects of that necessarily, you may have seen that as kind of a semiotic code enough that you're like, okay, that's kind of what this means. Like, in the same way that a blind person might understand that green is often associated with things like grass or nature, or even if they haven't actually seen it, just because of the kind of culture that they've grown up in that does have this emphasis on things like that. But it is interesting, yeah, because one of the difficulties with subtitling is that there's so much variation in terms of even amongst sort of deaf and capital D deaf, like profoundly deaf individuals, in terms of things like reading speed as well, because people who have been deaf since birth traditionally have slower reading speeds in English if BSL is their first language and things like that. So you've kind of got to always try and strike this balance between actually not removing information so that people that can hear it would understand, but also thinking about, yeah, like people that don't have that kind of point of reference and how that might manifest. But it is, I guess, important to note that most people are not profoundly deaf, so unfortunately a lot of the time the subtitles kind of default.
Oh, you've
Sorry, I just
muted yourself.
myself.
Gonna
Yeah.
say.
So the subtitles will default to kind of the most middle of the road kind of accessible, what that means. So yeah, there is a lot to be said about that, Steve, actually, but it's hard because there's just not the kind of money to do multiple tracks or to figure out actually what that might look like for different groups of people and what they actually require from subtitles. So
Right. So the next question from Liz, is there a standard framework for the way phrasing / tone, etc. is portrayed? For example, tone of voice?
Not a standard, I would say. I mean, classically, it's either just it being written in kind of brackets, whether they're square brackets or rounded brackets. So a particular sort of, sarcastically would be in there before the kind of utterance itself. Or, as I mentioned before, there's kind of unofficial convention with things like the exclamation mark in the brackets to represent things like irony and sarcasm. But no, it's not usually codified. It's kind of down to subtitlers themselves and the space that they have and what they think the kind of tone or the phrasing is supposed to kind of be matching, I suppose.
Interesting. So Eric has asked, do you know about any kind of extant canon around superbly subtitled films /show /anime, etc.? Are there examples that are renowned for any given reason?
Not really is the short answer. And part of the issue is that different subtitle tracks will exist for different. So when something is on Netflix, it will have a Netflix subtitle track, whereas if it then went onto Amazon Prime, it might not be the same one, or it may have a different one on its DVD, because a lot of it is tied to kind of distributors and kind of all this weird legal red tape that you would never really think about when it kind of comes to subtitling. So, for example, Archer, the second example I used, the second audio example, that probably was the closest to being frequently referenced as like very good or very innovative subtitling because the subtitling was quite different. And actually, when I was going back to look for the examples in this that I used in this, it's changed. The subtitles have changed that are on Netflix now, and the scene that I showed you has no paralanguage referenced at all in the subtitles now. So it's difficult because it's almost like kind of building your house on sand a lot of the time because it will just like the nature of especially streaming services mean that different legalities and different requirements will end up with these completely different tracks a lot of the time that don't necessarily. So for me, I would have said Archer as the answer to that question, but now it's like, well, I don't know where those subtitles can be accessed anymore, if they still can. Well, you can access them illegally, and that's a lot of things with subtitles, honestly, is that a lot of the time before that they weren't made by the companies because they weren't legally required to, so a lot of them were done by people that actually just did it out of passion for doing it. So there was more of that interest in actually creating a good end product rather than ticking an accessibility box, I think, which has kind of been lost to an extent in some aspects. So
brilliant. So the next one from Christopher isn't really a question. I think it's just a statement. So I don't know whether you want to read it, Emma, or whether you want me to read it out.
I'm happy to read it. So an interesting problem that comes up a lot in higher education, mathematical notation, equation information correctly defined in text. E.g., if you hear the words A plus B over C, does it mean A plus in brackets B/C or A plus B in brackets over C? And that's not getting started on Greek letters and font symbols, font formats that are symbols. I knew, Eric, you'd get involved in this as well. You guys can have a separate conversation about this. But yeah, totally. When you have to use kind of words to represent something that isn't really easily represent, or symbols, or trying to quantify it in a way that it wasn't necessarily meant to be, it's always going to be that kind of difficulty of kind of modulating both understanding and kind of as you kind of alluded to, that lack of ambiguity. And when you're kind of trying to work in these spaces, I think it can be quite difficult because it's just sorry, I'm getting distracted by reading the chat now. So I need to stop reading.
Go for it.
But yeah, no, anything that is just not easily represented by words being represented by words, it already changes something about it, you know? So you've got to kind of reckon with that when you're describing it or when you're talking about it or when you're subtitling it. So yeah. And there's some stuff about Sigma as a word being like a new gender orientated word. So yeah, you get, you know, the changing, shifting sort of meanings in general of things that and the associations. So hang on, sorry, Steve, last one. Oh, the machine, yeah, okay, the machine translated, like I hate these. So Steve's talking about Netflix shows where they're dubbed from another language having machine translated subtitles from the original language, and yet a lot of the time they just don't match up at all, so they are really distracting, and that's one of the big things that's, you know, constantly touted about subtitles where people don't like them, is because people feel like they're distracting or because people feel like they're inaccurate or they're not kind of fast enough. And it's these kind of often, especially in the case of these kind of machine translated ones on things like Netflix, it's sheer laziness and it's sheer greed on the part of, you know, industry, in that it's cheaper than hiring an actual person to do it. But they don't think about the sort of subtleties of this. And it's like, yeah, if you're trying to learn, say, you know, like I watch children's TV shows in German, and quite often I would like to put the subtitles on so that I can do the language learning thing. But yeah, as you said, they're not the same. They don't match the words that are being spoken, and it makes it even harder to kind of learn anything, because then your brain is spending that time being like, oh, why don't these things match up actually? Which I think is, you know, a problem with both inter and intralingual subtitling, honestly. It's just that it can be more or less obvious depending on sort of which one it is sometimes.
Interesting. I can see Joe is typing. So if anyone does have any more questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. But if there isn't any, we can let Emma get on with her afternoon.
I'm just going to pass out after this. But yeah, if there's no other questions, like, thank you so much everybody for coming. It was really great. I didn't think anybody was going to come, so to everybody that I've successfully bullied, and even more to the people that I didn't, thank you guys. You didn't even have to be bullied, so thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just a final one from me. If you want to make sure that you're up to date with any events, talks, future talks from Cultures of Film, make sure that you sign up to the mailing list if you haven't already. I'll pop it in the chat. But yeah, thank you very much, Emma, for that. It was incredibly interesting. And we have recorded it, so I'll make sure that you can access that on the Cultures of Film website. And Emma, if you'd like a copy, I'll send you it.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
Yes, thank you again, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, sign up to more of the Cultures of Film stuff because it's all going to be exciting.
Perfect. Thanks very
Thank you.
much.
Bye.
Bye.